My next guest has just returned a few days ago from a visit to Venezuela. Now, we're hearing a lot about Venezuela, but it's a lot more heat than light in terms of what is actually going on down there. So, we're going to talk to him about what he saw and heard while he was there. Max Blumenthal is an investigative journalist and an author. He is editor and co-founder of Gray Zone, the Gray Zone or Gray Zone Project, grayzone.com. And he has a new book coming out next month called The Management of Savagery. First of all, Max, thanks for coming on the program.
Good to be back.
Secondly, when you and I talked last about Venezuela, you hadn't left yet, but we talked about the fact that there was just a cloud of misinformation, a cloud of unknowing around the Venezuelan situation, and the fact that people seem to be reflexively, in at least the way I would put it, falling back into the kind of Cold War attitude about U.S. military intervention in Latin America, where there's almost uniformity of opinion between the two major political parties. There are very few people who are willing to break with the orthodoxy and say that military intervention by this country has a poor record, as a record of being a highly negative force, and that was disappointing. But you subsequently went to Venezuela. You spent what, 2 weeks there or so?
Like 2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks. What, if anything, was your takeaway that changed your perception of the situation down there? Did your perception change at all? Was it reinforced? What was your general impression?
Yeah, I'm never terribly shocked when I go into, let's say, a conflict zone or a country that's being targeted by the U.S. for regime change. But I always have to psychologically prepare myself to be somewhat wrong. So I, came in mentally prepared to see more economic and human despair than I expected to see. I said, what if the U.S. media is right? Like maybe, the situation is worse than I think. And what I found was that the situation, at least in Caracas and the surrounding states, was far more stable than I expected. The opposition was far more weak than I had anticipated. The coup had much less momentum and was indeed a reality show, kind of virtual reality coup. And I was actually stunned at how, despite an economic crisis, which was real, how functional daily life in Venezuelan society in Caracas was, down to the situation in the poor and working class barrios where people are subsisting thanks to state-subsidized food, what they call the CLAP boxes. The CLAP is the government program to supply the basic foodstuffs and sanitary needs for people who are living off of very meager salaries at a time of hyperinflation. And, getting to visit those markets, talking to the people in the barrios, and seeing government ministers, including the mayor of Caracas, who's a really interesting person, Erica Farias, actually, come to the markets and meet with constituents, and to see the support they get, just the genuine grassroots support they get, it really shows you that what we're hearing from these, Senate committees like the one that Marco Rubio chaired today about, this being a kind of crime family and a regime with no support in the streets that's on its way to collapsing is just a bunch of hot air. It's a psyop, another humanitarian interventionist psyop. And I think one of the most remarkable scenes for me was on February 23rd. That was the day when the U.S. planned to ram through its so-called humanitarian aid across the Santander Bridge between Colombia and Venezuela. This was the big stunt where they were going to either try to create some provocation where the Venezuelan government prevents the aid from coming in, and then they point the finger and say, you don't want foreign aid, you want to keep your people starving, even though they're allowing tons of aid from other countries that's coordinated in. Or they get the aid in and, something else happens. But basically the aid was a Trojan horse for intervention. They prevented it from coming in. And I had a ticket to go to the border that day on the Venezuelan side. And I chose to stay in Caracas because I thought it was going to be more interesting to see how the opposition internally behaved. And I learned that the opposition had directed its supporters to the La Carlota Air Base, which was a military air base that happened to be within walking distance from where I was staying at a rental in an opposition stronghold. The opposition focuses in the east of Caracas in a very affluent area, which would kind
Is
of...
this the one? Is it country club or is
It
it
feels
that, or-
like it,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
or it feels like, you know, going from the West Bank to, or East Jerusalem to like Tel Aviv. You know, it feels like people are lighter skinned there. There's sushi restaurants in the street. There's food, you know, gourmet food delivery places. You know, you're facing this beautiful green hill that people don't have sight of in the poorer barrios. And there's anti-Maduro graffiti everywhere. People are celebrating the opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez. He used to be the mayor. This is Chacao, Altamira, Palos Grandes, that area. So there happened to be this military air base there. So basically, the opposition just sent all its people out of their houses to surround it and to kind of stay there until the military defected. And so I went down there, and there was a pretty sizable crowd, and you could see mixed in among the crowd of white people, and they all wear white shirts for some reason, and they look like they're at a country club, you know, and it's a country club style atmosphere. Everybody's greeting each other. People are waving U.S. flags. This opposition leader named Maria Corina Machado shows up, and she is Rubio's proxy in Caracas. She's been involved in regime change coup plots, assassination plots. She's very close to the U.S. One of the most extreme figures. She's openly called for an R2P style intervention, and she bursts through the crowd and stands up in front of the military base on a makeshift stage like Evita and starts giving this, you know, speech calling for the liberation of Venezuela, and let's, you know, convince the military that we've been demonizing for years, that we're their friends, and yada, yada, yada. And then she storms out, and all of a sudden the crowd starts to dissipate, and the crowd just follows her out, and I stand around and I'm waiting for something to happen. And I was going to say, I can see that there are a few people who stand out within the crowd who are darker skinned youth, who are the guarimberos, who actually are the kids who were wearing gas masks. Some of them have masks on, and they're the ones who who really formed the front lines of the violent riots that held Caracas under siege in 2016, 2017, and killed many cops. Many bystanders were killed.
So they're also, just to interrupt, so they're also part of the same
They're in there, and
opposition movement, but
they come from a different class.
Yeah.
They're totally nihilistic, and they're basically mercenaries. They're like, a lot of them are like street kids who get paid to do this, but they're not ideological like the, you know, people who are riding nice motorcycles down to the protest and, you know, live in nice luxury apartments, or upper middle class people can afford sushi. In any case, I'm like, is something going to happen here? Like, these kids are out here. I haven't seen them before. Is this going to turn into a guarimba? And then everybody just leaves. And they just left. And I walked up in the neighborhood in Altamira, and everybody was going in for Chinese food. They were all going for lunch after the protest. It was like they went out for a picnic, an anti-Maduro picnic. And there's this whole Chinese restaurant that's filled. I look inside, and everybody's wearing a white shirt in there. And it's the upper middle class people having lunch, and a guy yells into the window, "Maduro!" And then the whole restaurant bellows out, "Coño tu madre!"
which
means,
we won't translate because we are FCC regulated, but it's basically a rude suggestion about your mother's anatomy.
The point is, they
right?
just gave up.
So
by 3 p.m., they'd totally given up. And I was sitting at an Italian restaurant across the street, and it was over.
So
and
let
that
me
was the
ask
end
you
of the
then.
coup. The coup, I just watched the coup end right then and there on February 23rd.
So, okay, there are a lot of implications there. I want to explore this for a minute. Max Blumenthal. Number one, why did they go if they weren't going to stay? I mean, were they just killing a few hours? What was the impetus? Who told them there's going to be a thing happening and you should go? And why did they go? And if they went, why did they leave?
Let me put it to you, explain it this way. We've heard a lot of bluster about intervention, and, you know, many of us in the anti-war community have worried about another humanitarian intervention that would turn Venezuela into a Libya-style dystopia and destabilize the region. And people even in governments in the Lima group, the right-wing Lima group, have the same concern because they are on the borders of Venezuela and they don't want their countries to be destabilized. The Brazilian military is very worried about this. They don't want to go as far as Jair Bolsonaro. The Costa Rican government has been very worried about this. Even Guatemala, which is run by this reality show TV clown who's a lot, Jimmy Morales, who's a lot like Trump, openly said we can't have military intervention. And these Russian pranksters who've done a lot of prank calls to world leaders actually got Elliot Abrams on the line. It hasn't been written about in the US, of course, but it was a very revealing phone call. Elliot Abrams, demonstrating great operational security, really shows his cards. And he tells them, he thinks that they're the president of, he's speaking to the president of the Swiss Federation, who's going to tell him where Maduro's secret bank accounts are. When, he's speaking to someone with clearly a thick Russian accent, who's just pulling his chain. And at the in a subsequent call to these pranksters, Abrams said, "Well, we have to keep threatening military invasion just to scare the Venezuelan military, but we're not actually going to do it. We're just waging economic warfare." So he basically admits that they can't do it. They don't have the diplomatic support. They don't have the support within Venezuela. Even opposition people would hate a war, and they tell me we're totally against a war.
And you published at Gray Zone, you published a poll showing that 86% of the people, including a lot of the people who would be politically opposed to the current government, don't want U.S. military intervention.
This is from a firm called Interlaces. Also, 81% are against sanctions, but they've been told. The U.S. has been pushing this line that, we might intervene, we might do it, we're totally behind you. And they sent the same message actually to the Syrian opposition and said, we're going to give you some weapons, but eventually we're going to come in with air power. So start fighting. And so the Venezuelan opposition...
It's what what the U.S. did to the Kurds in 1991 too.
Yeah, and to the Shia population in southern Iraq after the Gulf War, and said, rise up and we'll come in, and then they rose up and they were crushed. So the Venezuelan opposition had this swell of confidence that they would be supported from the outside in a way that they haven't been. And so basically on the 23rd, I watched them kind of come out and wait for something to happen and stand by the military base and wait for something to happen at the border, and nothing happened. And they don't have a game plan internally to make anything happen. That was crushed, I think, when the Guarimba riots were ended in 2017. That was kind of their last gasp. But now we're starting to see the opposition fracture internally, with Juan Guaido starting to kind of drift away alone on the back seat of a motorcycle, while the rest of the opposition groups say, what are we doing here? The military isn't defecting. Maybe we should engage in some talks. Do we really want these sanctions to come down? It's going to make the economic situation worse. And I think that Marco Rubio, if you watched his performance today in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee, Marco Rubio was even facing some opposition from the experts he brought in from the Wilson Center, who were even saying, the sanctions will cause starvation, and people who are starving do not protest. Rubio is increasingly isolated. I think the whole thing is kind of fallen apart. What will happen, however, are deepening sanctions. I mean, I don't think the U.S. can turn back from that. They're going to double down, partly out of humiliation.
For a lot of people, one of the reasons we're talking again about Venezuela is a lot of people are being seriously misinformed, in my opinion, about what's going on there in this country. And one of the things that people have heard, and this is why I want to kind of hammer at this point a little bit, one of the things that people have heard is that we and some generous-minded people like Richard Branson, the billionaire, tried to get some food into the poor, starving Venezuelans over this bridge from Colombia, and the military wants for people to starve, the Venezuelan military. They wouldn't allow it in. And so I think a lot of people formed this mental picture that the Venezuelan people are starving because...
These people who have formed that mental picture don't have a mental picture. I mean, how could you be that dumb?
Well, I don't think people are. I think people are misinformed by the U.S. media. I don't think it's a matter of the average person. I mean, I think if people are told certain things, they have a tendency to believe them. A lot of
Yeah,
people do.
yeah.
So that's the people I'm talking about here. And I think that if people come away thinking, well, I saw a story, they tried to get food to the people who were starving because of their dictator, Maduro, and the dictator wouldn't let the food in, that's as much as they know. And they may have heard the word sanctions, but listen, I've been around political communications for too long. I know that sanctions is not a concept that every
Right.
voter understands even the
Right.
word. Okay.
Right.
So what we're really talking about here, I mean, that's why I want to unpack that a little bit, if you bear with me. One is sanctions means, in this case, the prevention of certain items getting to the population of a country, right?
Including insulin, which the U.S. has obstructed from reaching Venezuela through sanctions.
So if our sanctions are preventing insulin from getting to the Venezuelan people, it's a medical fact that Venezuelans are dying as a result of our actions, because that's what happens to a diabetic that can't get insulin. So they're dying in this country because they can't afford it. They're dying in Venezuela if it's being sanctioned. What else is being sanctioned or prevented from getting to the Venezuelan people by our government policies?
Well, the Colombian and U.S. Intelligence services have actually set up a group to prevent the importation of medicines and medical supplies to Venezuela. The AP reported in February that a young person who was seeking, I think, cancer treatment or stem cell transplant has been prevented from receiving that in Europe due to U.S. sanctions on a foundation that was paying for child cancer treatment that was funded through Citgo, which is the U.S. arm of the Venezuelan oil company. And, Venezuela funds, since the election of Hugo Chavez, has funded a lot of social programs through PDVSA, which is the state oil company. The U.S. is now preventing Venezuela's government from receiving assets for oil sales by forcing all foreign buyers to pay assets into a separate account controlled by the U.S. Department of Treasury, which supposedly goes into the pocket of the self-proclaimed, coup puppet leader Juan Guaido, which means that they don't receive assets on oil sales, so they can't not only restructure their debt, offset the speculation black market economy by imposing price controls and keeping prices lower for the poor on food. They can't purchase food, unlike Nicaragua, which has anywhere from 70 to 90% food sovereignty, meaning they produce that much of their own food. Most of Venezuelan food and medicine is imported. And so they're unable, the government is increasingly unable, thanks to sanctions, to import medicine and food. This is the goal. And today, Marco Rubio said that sanctions and widespread unrest, by encouraging sanctions and widespread unrest, we will bring down this government, which he calls a crime family. So the U.S. is doing this deliberately. It's a long-standing tactic. It was done to Iran and caused a lot of hardship in Iran to bring them to the negotiating table and produce the Iran deal. And the U.S. just kept trying to get a better deal by making the economy scream. But it's something the U.S. has done to Iraq as well. There was a Lancet study which said that, 500,000 Iraqi children had died due to sanctions. That study's been challenged, but when it was put to Madeleine Albright, then the Secretary of State, she said, even if the numbers were inflated, she said it was still worth it. So that's the mentality of the sociopaths inside the Beltway, is that we will make people die in order to achieve our political goals. So sanctions is warfare by other means, and you're right. You're right. The average voter, including a progressive voter, doesn't consider sanctions a form of warfare, so Washington tends to get away with it. And then you bring in the attempt at U.S. aid. I think it was $200 million of aid, while they've blocked, already they've seized $17 billion in Venezuelan assets in the last 2 months. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to what they've seized. And they had no plan to distribute it. The opposition had signed up 30,000 people to distribute it, but they had no plan to get it to people in need. It didn't actually contain vital medicines. It was basically the same kind of food that the government distributes to millions of people every day. So, The government already has that taken care of. It was just a Trojan horse to invade Venezuelan territory and to create a provocation. And so there was this scene on the bridge on the 23rd of February that the whole world was supposed to be watching just so we could see Maduro's cruelty. And what the U.S. did was kind of deploy Colombian security forces, which then brought these violent Guarimbero youth, many of them were Venezuelan exiles, some were just Colombians, to escort the trucks carrying the aid to the bridge to confront Venezuelan riot police with Molotov cocktails. And towards the end of the day, they just tossed Molotov cocktails onto the back of one of the aid trucks. The aid burned, and then they blamed the Venezuelan government for burning the aid. And that was kind of the provocation that they attempted to stage. And I produced video of them throwing the Molotov cocktail straight up onto the truck. The Colombian president comes out, Ivan Duque, this right-wing U.S. vassal, and he says that Maduro's so cruel, he burned the aid. Marco Rubio says the same thing. But the provocation really fell flat. It didn't lead to anything else, and now we're back at, increasing sanctions again. And this is where it kind of gets interesting, because we watched the U.S. lose in Syria, and for the first time since the Cold War, the kind of unipolar order was flouted as the Syrian government called on allies in Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and mobilized its own population to stop this multi-billion-dollar regime change war. And they won. The situation's been stabilized. The U.S. is pulling its troops out under the watch of Donald Trump. Venezuela is now mobilizing its allies, China, Russia, Turkey. It actually has a lot of allies in the Caribbean, Cuba, Bolivia, all these countries that are sort of a non-aligned group that aren't aligned with the U.S. and in many ways are pushing back against the unipolar hegemony. And if they can provide Venezuela with alternative sources of assets to sell its oil to, and if Venezuela can start importing medicines and goods from China, which isn't even now one of the top 4 sources of imports, it will be another gigantic blow to the U.S. ability to control the world in its own hemisphere, where John Bolton has openly said, we're trying to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It would be this would represent a titanic shift in the world order. And so I think that's why it's really important to keep watching it as we see the world change before our eyes.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting aspect of this. If you are, as I am, if one is, as I am, not a fan of empire as a concept or the American empire as an undertaking that this country should be involved in, that's an interesting development. But if you are a promoter of America as an empire, if you're a John Bolton or a Madeleine Albright or anyone else who thinks that, in fact, we should, whether you say it or not, that we should be imposing our will on this hemisphere and elsewhere, as it turns out, this seems to me, what you're saying pretty clearly is this is a counterproductive course of action, because the more they push, the more they're going to expose vulnerabilities, the more other players are going to come in and fill the gap, and we will have, in effect, an outpost of the post-American empire world order in South America.
And already,
is that a fair take?
Just as one example of how the U.S. has scored an own goal, it is now receiving record levels, I'd say record meaning in the last decade, record levels of oil imports from Russia to offset the oil.
It meaning Venezuela.
The United States is importing a level of oil from Russia that hasn't been seen in over a decade, since it really kind of initiated the new Cold War and started pushing back against Russia to offset the oil that it refuses to accept from Venezuela. So it just shows how the U.S. is not, what it's trying to do to Venezuela is, on a global scale, an act of self-sabotage. From the imperial perspective.
From the imperial perspective.
And, Venezuela had depended heavily on U.S. refineries because their crude oil needs to be mixed with light crude, and they could only do that in Texas at the Citgo refineries, and now the U.S. is saying no, so Russia's helping them, refine their oil with Russian light crude, and it's like taking the U.S. offline, taking the U.S. economy offline and forcing the U.S. to depend more on Russian oil imports while the U.S. is trying to start this new Cold War with Russia. It doesn't make sense.
Well, it's interesting because it's fascinating too, because there are two kind of post-Westphalian powers at work in what you describe, and the Westphalian, the identification of nation states and so on. One is the American empire, which is obviously projected well beyond the borders of the United States. The other is the empire of oil and the oil corporations and their own power. What I was thinking when you were talking about this shift is that, for example, Rex Tillerson, Trump's first Secretary of State, former CEO and chairman of ExxonMobil, by my view, leader of one of the greatest crimes against humanity ever, which is the concealment of oil's effect on climate change for many years, which is a crime of such magnitude it's incalculable in a way. But his great diplomatic, quote unquote, claim to fame, since he had never served in government before going to work for Trump, was, as I recall, if I recall correctly, was doing oil deals with Russia. So you have these two nation state entities, the American empire hurting American empire interests by imposing this sanction, and then you have the oil industry finding other solutions elsewhere and importing Russian oil to the U.S. Does that make any sense? And are we seeing a kind of breakdown of, are we seeing a kind of chaos or anarchy of an overreaching empire actually dissolving in front of our eyes? Because that's the image I get.
There are fractures in the empire for sure. But I'm glad you brought up Tillerson. There have been all these quotes that I've seen about Donald Trump on his first day declaring that he wanted to do regime change in Venezuela, and that this was Trump's priority. And I wonder who would have supplied those quotes to the media, because I don't actually see Donald Trump caring about Venezuela or thinking on the first day of his administration about anything relating to Venezuela. It just doesn't seem Trumpian to me. It's like, he's thinking about maybe some war room thing or how he can have a military parade or something to make himself seem great. I think Tillerson is supplying those quotes. I think Tillerson is heavily involved behind the scenes. That it was Tillerson on the first day who wanted regime change in Venezuela because of his relationship with Exxon. And Exxon really wants access to those oil fields and to just the oil reserves, which represent the largest oil reserves in the world are in Venezuela. Some of them are untapped. And Venezuela traditionally had been rented since World War I by U.S. oil companies, to the point where Hitler sent his U-boats during World War II to sink oil tankers coming out of Venezuela because they were supplying the U.S. war machine. Exxon was getting oil at a very favorable rate until Hugo Chavez came along, and they would like to go back to that. And if you look closely at Juan Guaido's, which is not really Juan Guaido, but the Plan País, it's just this neoliberal plan for returning the economy to international finance and the extraction industries. Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, these groups, they're funding a think tank in Washington called the Council on the Americas, which was founded by David Rockefeller as a corporate roundtable for Latin America. And they testified, they brought one of their experts before Rubio today, Eric Farnsworth. They're supplying a lot of the quotes to mainstream media about how Maduro's running a crime family. They're really marketing the U.S. regime change effort, and they're doing so on behalf of their funders, the arms industry, the extraction industry, and international finance. And it's because they want to remove a government that has attempted to impose some kind of democratic socialism on an economy that was previously a neoliberal, libertarian petrostate that guys like Rex Tillerson wanted to feast off of. So Tillerson's still a big player in this, and so is Exxon, and this indeed is about oil. Just one other point about oil. You know, oil was central to the success of Chavismo. The price of oil was $80 a barrel in the golden days of Chavismo, which was 2006, 2007. 2007 is when the U.S. started coming in with its soft power organizations and trying to mess things up. That's when they started training Juan Guaido and his leader, Leopoldo Lopez. And one of the biggest successes for the U.S. was when as far as regime change in Venezuela went, was in 2014 when the price of the oil barrels went down dramatically. Why did it go down? Because, and this was reported in the Wall Street Journal, in oil industry publications at the time, that John Kerry had made a deal with, I think, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, or it was the Crown Prince, to increase Saudi capacity production in order to harm Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, which rely heavily on high oil prices. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia would gain U.S. support in Syria, and the U.S. would increase its delivery of weapons to Saudi-backed rebels. This was reported openly in the Wall Street Journal. And this is what tanked the Venezuelan economy and made it so hard for Venezuela's government to start to offset the speculatory black market economy with price controls. This was kind of the beginning of the crisis that we're now seeing. And so it wasn't something that occurred organically. It was due to the petrodollar and the U.S. special relationship with Saudi Arabia. Maduro actually came out and openly said they're doing this to harm Russia, when he himself was a target.
Now, not only is it, the other implication of that, of course, is that it was done to undermine the form of government that Venezuela had chosen for itself. So I guess for just my closing thought is this. I mean, what you're really describing, there's a lot of talk now here in this country about Green New Deal, about a jobs guarantee, about, and a debate where I stand on this debate is that we have to look at these things in a kind of systems way, in an integrated way, that you can't eliminate or reduce our dependence on climate-destroying fossil fuels without also changing our economic system that generates that, that allows people to exploit that. And I think a lot of people who consider themselves progressive in this country understand that it's a puzzle with pieces that fit together. But I think for a lot of people, that mental puzzle image is missing a very big piece. And that piece is foreign policy. And that if you don't understand the way that petropolitics and other kinds of geopolitics and military adventurism, or whatever you want to call it, imperial policies play into all of this, you don't have a fully three-dimensional view of the world. And it's critical not only as a moral imperative, because we're for American citizens, but just for a complete understanding of the world around you, to understand what's going on in a country like Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a subject that I've had to play catch up on just to understand the motives behind regime change in Venezuela. And then there's also the dollar, the dominance of the dollar, and how when a country threatens to, or a government threatens to de-link its economy from the dollar, for example, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi said he was going to back his currency with gold. A year later, he faced a pretty intense regime change plot which ended with him being sodomized with a bayonet by U.S.-backed al-Qaeda allies from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. I think there was an attempt, or there were discussions in Syria of doing something similar. Iran, this is another country that's tried to link its currency to gold, and other, the Chinese yuan is a huge threat to the U.S., also Chinese technology. And I think after Iraq, we're not really looking towards a future of conventional warfare where the U.S. is going to try to confront militaries head on and risk losing a lot of the guys in the Rust Belt whose families are Trump's base. What they want to do is economic warfare, trade wars with China, and sanctions. And this kind of thing happens below the radar of most Americans. I think progressives who are concerned about foreign policy and war need to pay closer attention to the details of these policies, because ultimately it is creating instability and it will generate blowback here one way or another.
And people who think we're an ennobling force, who still think that the United States is an ennobling force, should remember you've described briefly the horrific nature of Gaddafi, whatever you think of Gaddafi, the horrific nature of his death, to which then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, we saw,
he died. And then she cackled.
And laughed.
You know, that should have disqualified her, along with the fact that she and Barack Obama presided over the return of slavery to the African continent in Libya. But,
and also reported, deliberately altered the reporting of child slavery in, what was it, Malaysia, in I think it was rubber tree cultivation in order to enact a trade deal. So we could go on and on with examples of this. But
I think we should put this to the candidates in 2020 and really force them to address the issue of sanctions, which do harm ordinary people. And that's another thing for progressives to do. The people who watch your show should make this a source of debate, including for Bernie, who really hasn't taken a strong stand against sanctioning Venezuela, and all the money that we're putting into all of these fake soft power groups that just destabilize countries should come back here. And finally, why are we talking about food instability in Venezuela when there's so much of it surrounding this neighborhood where this studio is situated? Something very few politicians on the national stage talk about. Isn't it weird to talk about it in other countries, and we never talk about food instability and hunger in the U.S.?
And it's a great point on which we are unfortunately going to have to end. But this neighborhood, Anacostia, is a food desert. It is a place
where there's
where
no supermarket here.
There's no so couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. But Max Blumenthal, journalist, editor of the Gray Zone Project, grayzone.com, and author of the forthcoming book, The Management of Savagery. Again, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot, RJ.